A floor cleaner is brutally beaten in a dark alleyway simply for working in the building of the most notorious mafia boss on the East Coast. She returns to work with broken ribs and a bruised face. And for the first time in 10 months, the most powerful man in the city sees her. What happens next shakes all of Chicago. Follow the story to the end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. Rain came down in silver sheets across downtown Chicago, hammering the pavement so hard it sounded like static on a dead channel. The kind of rain that made the city feel submerged. Gutters overflowed into the streets. Taxis crawled through intersections with their wipers slapping uselessly against the flood. Nobody walked if they could avoid it. Amara Vale walked. She pushed her janitor's cart through the service entrance of Blackthorn Tower at 9:14 in the evening, water streaming off her maintenance jacket and pooling on the polished concrete. The security guard at the loading dock barely looked up from his phone. He never did. She swiped her badge against the reader, heard the familiar click, and disappeared into the freight elevator before the door had finished opening. At 32 years old, Amara had perfected something most people never thought about: invisibility. Not the supernatural kind. The human kind. The kind built from silence, routine, downcast eyes, and the unspoken agreement between the wealthy and the people who cleaned up after them. The agreement that said you don't exist unless something goes wrong. She had worked at Blackthorn Global Holdings for 10 months. In that time, she had memorized the schedules of every executive on the upper floors. She knew which board members left coffee rings on mahogany. She knew which ones dropped cigar ash into potted plants and expected someone else to deal with it. She knew the CFO kept a bottle of bourbon in his bottom drawer, and the chief legal officer made phone calls at 2 in the morning that always ended with him whispering the same phrase: "It's handled." None of them knew her name. None of them had ever asked. The freight elevator groaned upward through the building's spine. Amara leaned against the back wall and pressed her palm against her lower back, where the ache lived permanently now. 16-hour shifts did that. The first 8 hours she spent at a laundromat on the south side, feeding industrial machines and folding sheets that smelled like bleach and strangers. Then she came here. Blackthorn, the crown jewel. 46 floors of glass and steel and money that moved in directions she wasn't supposed to understand. Every dollar she earned vanished before it reached her hands. Marcus had been dead for 14 months, but his medical debt lived on like a parasite feeding on her future. Her younger brother, 26 years old, a burst appendix that turned septic because he waited 3 days to go to the emergency room, afraid of the cost. By the time Amara got the call, he was already in surgery. By the time the surgeons came out with that look on their faces, the one that started with "we did everything we could," Marcus was gone, and the hospital had already generated an invoice that would follow Amara for the rest of her life. $147,000 for a dead man. The elevator opened on the 38th floor, and Amara pushed her cart into the corridor. Fluorescent light hummed above her. The hallway stretched in both directions. Identical doors, identical carpet, identical silence. She started with the East Wing conference rooms, the way she always did. Spray the glass, wipe the tables, empty the trash, vacuum the carpet in lines so straight they looked machined, move to the next room, repeat. She didn't think about it anymore. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking meant calculating how many years it would take to pay off the debt at this rate. Thinking meant remembering Marcus's laugh, the way he used to call her Mara because he said the full name sounded too serious for someone who still watched cartoons on Saturday mornings. Thinking meant standing in the middle of a conference room at midnight, surrounded by furniture that cost more than her annual salary, and feeling the specific kind of rage that had no target and no exit. So she didn't think. She cleaned. 3 hours into her shift, she reached the executive suite on the 44th floor. This was different territory. The carpet was thicker. The air smelled like leather and something expensive she couldn't name. The conference table seated 20 and was made from a single slab of imported wood that had been polished until it reflected the ceiling lights like dark water. Amara sprayed it down and began wiping in slow circles. Voices drifted from somewhere down the hall. 2 men. She recognized the cadence. Board members. They often stayed late on Wednesdays, though she never understood why. Their conversations were always fragments when she caught them. Numbers, names, cities she had never been to, Occasionally a laugh that sounded more like a warning than amusement. Tonight was different. Moretti wants the port deal closed before the quarter, one voice said. If customs flags another shipment, we're looking at federal attention. Federal attention is manageable. We've managed it before. Not like this. The old families are pushing. Caruso lost 3 warehouses last month and he's blaming us. Caruso is a relic. He barely controls his own crew anymore. Relics still have teeth. Amara kept wiping. She had learned early that the most important skill in this building wasn't cleaning. It was unhearing, taking the words that floated through walls and doors and open hallways and letting them pass through her mind like water through a sieve. She didn't store them. She didn't analyze them. She didn't care. Blackthorn Global was dirty. She had known that within the first week. The late-night phone calls, the locked rooms on the 46th floor, the men who arrived through the service entrance in unmarked cars at 3 a.m. and left before dawn. She wasn't stupid. She just couldn't afford to be curious. Curiosity didn't pay medical bills. She finished the executive suite by 1:30 and worked her way back down. The building emptied gradually around her. Security guards rotated shifts. The overnight receptionist in the lobby read a paperback with her feet propped on the desk. By 3 a.m, Amara was essentially alone in a 46-story monument to money she would never touch. She clocked out at 4:15. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick, reflecting neon and headlights in long, distorted streaks. Amara pulled her hood up and walked toward the L station 6 blocks east. Her shoes were wet. Her back screamed. She thought about the sandwich she had packed for tomorrow's shift, turkey and mustard on white bread, the same thing she ate every day because it was cheap, and she could make 5 of them on Sunday and not think about food for the rest of the week. She was thinking about that sandwich when the hands grabbed her. 2 of them. Coming from behind, one clamped over her mouth so hard her teeth cut into her lip. The other wrapped around her torso and lifted her off the sidewalk like she weighed nothing. She was dragged sideways into an alley between 2 buildings, her shoes scraping against wet asphalt, her scream dying against the leather glove, crushing her face. They slammed her back against the brick wall. The impact knocked the air out of her lungs, and she crumpled forward, gasping. Before she could orient herself, a fist connected with her left cheekbone. The world tilted. Color exploded behind her eyes. She hit the ground on her hands and knees, tasting copper. 2 men stood above her. Both wore black jackets with the Blackthorn security logo on the breast pocket. She recognized the logo because she had cleaned those jackets out of the lost and found before. But she didn't recognize the faces. These weren't building security. These were something else. "Get up," the taller one said. Amara didn't get up. She couldn't. Her arms were shaking too badly, and the world was still spinning from the blow to her face. A boot pressed down on her right wrist. Slowly, deliberately. The pressure increased until the bones flexed, and she heard herself make a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like something being squeezed out of her throat against her will. "You work in Moretti's building," the man said. His voice was calm, almost bored, like he had done this enough times that the violence had become administrative. "We know you clean the executive floors. We know you're there every night." I just clean." The boot pressed harder. Something in her wrist made a sound like a green branch bending. "Tell them the old families are done bowing." The other man kicked her in the ribs. Not once, 3 times. Each kick landing with mechanical precision in the same spot until something cracked and the pain went from sharp to white to a frequency she had never experienced before. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't scream. She could only curl into herself on the wet ground while the rain started again, cold drops hitting her face like tiny indifferent fingers. "Make sure he gets the message," the taller one said. The final blow caught her in the temple. The alley dissolved into static. The last thing she registered was the sound of their footsteps walking away, unhurried, like men leaving a job site after an ordinary shift. She lay in the rain for almost an hour. A garbage truck driver found her at 5:20 in the morning, slumped against a dumpster with blood running from her hairline into her collar. He called an ambulance. The paramedics asked questions she couldn't answer through her swollen jaw. They loaded her onto a gurney and took her to a county hospital where a tired resident cleaned her wounds under fluorescent light and told her she had 2 fractured ribs, a hairline fracture in her right wrist, and a concussion. You should stay overnight for observation, the resident said. I can't afford overnight. He looked at her for a moment. That look. The one medical professionals gave when they understood that the system they worked inside was actively hostile to the people it was supposed to serve. At least let me wrap the ribs properly. She let him. Then she signed herself out against medical advice, took 3 buses back to her apartment on the south side, and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for 40 minutes without moving. Her face in the bathroom mirror was someone else's. The left cheekbone was purple and swollen, distorting the shape of her eye. Her lip was split and crusted with dried blood. Fingerprint bruises circled her wrist like a grotesque bracelet. Every breath sent a spike through her left side where the ribs had cracked. She should have called the police, she knew that, but the men had worn Blackthorn jackets. They had known her schedule, her floor assignments, her route home. Whoever sent them had access to information that came from inside the building. Going to the police meant going against people who had already demonstrated exactly how far they were willing to go. And besides, police cost time, time cost shifts, shifts cost money. Money was the only thing standing between her and the debt that would swallow her whole. So the next evening, at 9:14, Amara Vale pushed her janitor's cart through the service entrance of Blackthorn Tower. The security guard at the loading dock looked up from his phone. He stared at her face for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back down. She swiped her badge, heard the click, disappeared into the freight elevator. Her ribs screamed with every step. She had wrapped them with an ace bandage from the dollar store, pulling it tight enough that breathing became a conscious decision rather than an automatic function. Her wrist throbbed inside a cheap brace. She moved slower than usual. The cart felt heavier. The spray bottles weighed twice what they should have. But she was here. Because the debt didn't care about fractured ribs. The bill collectors didn't ask if she was injured. The hospital where Marcus died didn't offer grace periods for physical assault. The machinery of her financial ruin operated on a schedule that had no pause button, and missing even one shift meant falling further behind the line she was already drowning beneath. She cleaned the 38th floor in silence. Spray, wipe, empty, vacuum. The motions were muscle memory, which was fortunate because her conscious mind was occupied entirely with managing pain. Every time she bent to empty a trash can, her ribs sent a signal up her spine that made her vision blur. Every time she lifted the vacuum, her wrist buckled. By midnight, she had made it to the 44th floor. The executive suite was supposed to be empty. It always was at this hour. The board members finished their meetings by 10 at the latest, and the floor went dark until morning. But tonight, the lights were on. Amara hesitated at the corridor entrance. Through the glass walls of the main conference room, she could see figures seated around the massive table. 12 men in suits. Some she recognized from the building. Others she didn't. At the head of the table, a chair sat empty. She should have turned around, cleaned another floor first, come back later. Instead, she pushed her cart forward, keeping her head down, staying close to the far wall. She would slip into the small kitchen adjacent to the conference room, restock the water glasses, and leave. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. They wouldn't notice her. They never did. She was inside the kitchen, pulling water bottles from the cabinet beneath the counter, when the conference room door opened. Conversation stopped. Not gradually. Not the way sound fades when people get distracted. It stopped the way a switch kills a light. Instant, total, complete. Amara heard a single set of footsteps crossing the conference room floor. Deliberate. Measured. The kind of walk that didn't hurry because it didn't need to. Through the kitchen's serving window, she saw him. Luca Moretti. She had never seen him in person before. In 10 months of working this building, cleaning his floors, emptying trash cans that held his discarded papers, she had never once been in the same room as the man whose name made this city hold its breath. He was taller than she expected, 6'3", maybe 6'4", a charcoal suit that fit like it had been built onto his body. Dark hair pushed back from a face that was handsome, the way a knife is handsome. All angles and edges, and the suggestion that beauty and danger occupied the same space. Silver cufflinks caught the light as he moved. His eyes were dark and carried the flat calm of a man who had long ago accepted what he was capable of. He didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table and looked at the 12 men seated around it, and every single one of them straightened in their chairs like children caught misbehaving. "The Caruso situation," Luca said. His voice was low, even, stripped of performance. "Tell me where we stand." One of the men, the CFO, Amara recognized his voice, began speaking rapidly about supply lines and distribution points and margins. Luca listened without expression. His eyes moved slowly around the table, cataloging each face, reading each reaction. Amara crouched below the serving window and continued stacking water glasses as quietly as possible. Her ribs protested the position. Her wrist shook. She just needed to finish and leave. 2 more minutes. She reached for the last bottle on the shelf, and her hand betrayed her. The brace on her wrist caught the edge of a glass. It tumbled off the counter and shattered on the tile floor with a sound that cut through the conference room like a gunshot. Every head turned. Amara froze on her knees, surrounded by broken glass, her bruised face fully visible through the serving window. Luca Moretti looked directly at her. The CFO was still talking. He trailed off when he realized nobody was listening anymore. Luca held her gaze for a long moment. His expression didn't change. But something shifted behind his eyes. A calculation, an assessment, something mechanical and precise clicking into place. Then he turned back to the table. "Continue," he said. The meeting resumed. Amara swept the broken glass with trembling hands, loaded her cart, and slipped out of the kitchen as fast as her broken ribs allowed. She made it to the freight elevator before her legs gave out. She slid down the wall and sat on the cold floor, breathing in short, shallow gasps, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't press the button. He had seen her. Luca Moretti had looked directly at her face and seen the bruises, the split lip, the wrist brace, the fear, and he had said nothing. She told herself that was good. That meant she was still invisible, still beneath notice, still safe inside the machinery of insignificance that had protected her for 10 months. She told herself that all the way home. She was still telling herself that the next night when she arrived for her shift and found a handwritten note tucked inside her locker in the basement changing room. 4 words in black ink on heavy cream-colored paper. My office. Tonight. Midnight. No signature. None was needed. Amara stared at the note until the paper began to shake in her fingers. Then she folded it carefully, slid it into her pocket, and pushed her cart toward the elevator. The clock on the basement wall read 9:17. She had 2 hours and 43 minutes to decide whether to walk into a room with the most dangerous man in Chicago, or run and never come back. Her ribs ached. Her wrist throbbed. And somewhere on the 46th floor, behind a door she had never been allowed to clean, Luca Moretti was waiting. Amara stood in front of her open locker at 11:41 and stared at the note like it might spontaneously combust if she looked at it long enough. The basement changing room smelled like industrial bleach and wet concrete. A single fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, casting everything in a yellowish pall that made her reflection in the dented locker mirror look jaundiced. The bruise on her cheekbone had deepened from purple to a sickly greenish black. Her lip was still swollen where the split hadn't fully closed. She looked like someone who had been in a car accident and then decided to go to work anyway, which, in a sense, was exactly what had happened. She pulled the note out of her pocket for the 6th time. My office. Tonight. Midnight. The paper was heavy. Expensive. The kind of stationery that cost more per sheet than her hourly wage. The handwriting was precise but unhurried. Someone who wrote with a fountain pen and didn't rush because the world waited for them, not the other way around. She had 2 options. Option 1, ignore the note, finish her shift, walk out the service entrance, take 3 buses home, and start looking for a new job in the morning. Leave Blackthorn behind. Find another building to clean, another set of executives to be invisible around, another midnight to dawn routine that paid just enough to keep the debt collectors from escalating to litigation. Option 2, take the elevator to the 46th floor at midnight and sit across from a man who, according to every whispered rumor she had absorbed through 10 months of unhearing, had personally ordered the disappearance of at least 11 people. Her ribs made the decision for her, not philosophically, physically. She shifted her weight, and the fractured bones ground against each other, and the pain spiked so hard her vision tunneled, and she grabbed the locker door to keep from doubling over. The ace bandage was soaked with sweat. The cheap wrist brace had started cutting into her skin where the Velcro rubbed. She needed real medical care, the kind that came with imaging and proper splints and prescriptions she couldn't fill. And she needed this job. Walking away from Blackthorn meant walking away from the only paycheck that kept her above the waterline. The laundromat paid $8 an hour. Blackthorn paid $19 plus overnight differential. Losing this meant defaulting on the payment plan with the hospital. Defaulting meant collections. Collections meant garnished wages. Garnished wages from an $8 an hour laundromat job meant she would never climb out. Marcus would be dead and she would be buried with him. Just slower. She closed the locker. She pushed her card into the freight elevator. She pressed the button for 46. The elevator climbed. Amara watched the numbers change on the panel above the door and felt her heartbeat in her fractured wrist, felt it in the bruise on her cheekbone, felt it in the cracked ribs that flexed with every shallow breath. The building hummed around her. Somewhere below, the overnight security guard was reading his paperback. Somewhere above, Luca Moretti was waiting in a room she had never been authorized to enter. The doors opened at 11:58. The 46th floor was nothing like the rest of the building. No fluorescent lights, no corporate carpet. The hallway was paneled in dark wood that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Recessed fixtures cast warm pools at intervals along the floor. The air smelled different up here. Leather, cedar, something smoky that clung to the back of her throat. A single door waited at the end of the corridor. No nameplate, no number. Just a door made from wood so dark it was almost black, with a brass handle that gleamed like a small weapon. Amara left her cart by the elevator. She walked the length of the hallway on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. Her wet shoes made no sound on the thick carpet. She stopped in front of the door and raised her hand to knock. The door opened before her knuckles touched wood. A man she didn't recognize stood inside. Tall, wide shoulders filling a dark suit, an earpiece coiled into his collar. He looked at Amara the way a scanner looks at a barcode. Quick, impersonal, cataloging. "She's here," he said to someone she couldn't see. Then he stepped aside. The office behind him was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows formed the far wall, and Chicago spread out beyond them like a circuit board. Millions of lights pulsing in the darkness, the lake a void of black beyond the skyline. Rain streaked the glass in irregular patterns. The room itself was sparse. A desk the size of a dining table, dark wood, nearly empty. 2 leather chairs facing it. A bar cart in the corner with cut crystal that caught light from somewhere above. Bookshelves lined one wall, though Amara couldn't read the spines from where she stood. Luca Moretti sat behind the desk. He wasn't doing anything, not reading, not writing, not looking at a phone or a computer. He was simply sitting with his hands folded on the desk surface, watching the door, watching her, with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "Sit down," he said. Amara didn't move immediately. Her body was doing something her mind couldn't override. A primal calculation running beneath conscious thought, measuring the distance to the door, the size of the man who had opened it, the angle of the windows, the exits she could see, and the ones she couldn't. "I'm not going to hurt you," Luca said. "Sit." She sat. The leather chair swallowed her. It was the most comfortable thing she had touched in months, maybe years, and she hated how good it felt because comfort was a trap when offered by dangerous people. Luca studied her face. The silence lasted long enough for Amara to hear the rain against the windows, the distant hum of the building's climate system, and her own breathing, shallow, careful, rationed by broken ribs. "Tell me about the alley," he said. "I already told security. I filed—" "You didn't file anything. I checked." Amara's mouth closed. Luca leaned back slightly. "You came to work with 2 fractured ribs, a damaged wrist, and contusions consistent with a focused assault. You didn't go to a hospital. You didn't report the incident. You didn't file a workers' compensation claim or request leave. You showed up at 9:14 the following evening and pushed a cart through my building like nothing happened." He paused. "That's either extraordinary discipline or extraordinary desperation. Tell me which." "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." "Why?" The question came out harder than she intended. Almost aggressive. She heard it leave her mouth and immediately wanted to pull it back, but Luca's expression didn't change. If anything, something in his eyes sharpened. The faintest flicker of interest, like a predator noticing unexpected movement in otherwise still grass. "Because someone used my building to send me a message," he said, "and they used you to deliver it." "I'm a janitor. I clean floors. I don't deliver anything. The men who beat you, what did they say? Amara looked at her hands in her lap, the wrist brace, the bruised knuckles. Her fingers were trembling again, and she couldn't make them stop. They said the old families are done bowing. Luca's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible. But Amara caught it because she had spent a lifetime reading small movements, learning which shifts in a landlord's expression meant the rent grace period was over, which micro-expressions on a bill collector's face meant they were about to escalate, which tightening of a stranger's posture on a late-night train meant she should move to a different car. Caruso, Luca said quietly. Not to her, to himself. He stood from the desk and walked to the windows. Chicago reflected in the glass and in his eyes simultaneously, turning him into a silhouette framed by a million points of light. How long have you worked here? 10 months? And in 10 months you've never spoken to anyone above floor supervisor level? No. Never accessed restricted areas? No. Never asked questions about what happens on this floor? I clean, that's it. I clean and I go home. Luca turned from the window. Then why did they pick you? The question hung in the air between them. Amara had asked herself the same thing 40 times since the alley. Why her? There were dozens of maintenance workers in the building. Some of them had been there for years. Some of them probably knew far more than she did about what went on behind closed doors. She was the newest, the quietest, the most invisible. Because nobody would notice, she said. The words came out flat, factual, like reading a weather report about her own disposability. Luca stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He picked up his desk phone, pressed a single button, and spoke 4 words. Get Dante up here. He hung up and returned to his chair. The silence resumed. Amara sat in it like a passenger in a vehicle she couldn't steer, watching Luca's face for any indication of what was coming, finding nothing. 3 minutes later, the office door opened. The man who entered was younger than Luca by maybe 10 years, late 20s, dark hair cropped close, a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't arranged into a permanent expression of barely contained hostility. He wore a black suit with no tie and moved with the coiled energy of someone who had been trained to do violence quickly and efficiently. This is Dante Ferraro, Luca said. He handles internal security. Dante looked at Amara the way the first man had, scanning, cataloging, but with something additional, suspicion, the kind that lived behind the eyes and never fully switched off. This is her, Dante said. This is her. Dante circled behind Amara's chair. She felt him back there like a heat source, her skin prickling with the instinctive awareness of a body that had recently been attacked from behind. The cameras in the East Alley were disabled between 3:40 and 4:30, Dante said. Someone on our security rotation killed the feed. I've got 6 guards on that shift and I can't eliminate any of them yet. Then eliminate all of them, Luca said. We fire 6 guards at once. It sends a signal. Good. Let it signal. Dante stopped circling. He stood beside Luca's desk and folded his arms. You're making a lot of noise over a janitor. The room temperature dropped. Luca's eyes moved to Dante with a speed that was almost mechanical. Say that again. Dante held his ground, but barely. His jaw worked, his shoulders shifted, the posture of a man who recognized he had stepped on a wire and was calculating whether to lift his foot or keep pressing. I'm saying the Caruso play is obvious, Dante said carefully. They picked someone expendable to deliver a message. If we overreact, someone expendable. Luca repeated the words like he was tasting them, finding them rotten. She works in this building. She works for me. She was attacked because of her proximity to me. And what calculation does that make her expendable? I didn't mean you meant exactly what you said. And now I know how you think. Luca stood slowly. Find the guards who killed the camera feed. Find the men who touched her. Bring them to the dock warehouse. You have 72 hours. Dante's jaw tightened. He glanced at Amara one more time, and she saw it clearly now, the suspicion hardening into something more personal. Resentment. This woman had appeared from nowhere and redirected his boss's attention in a way that disrupted the established order, and he didn't like it. 72 hours, Dante repeated. Did I stutter? Dante left without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam. Amara exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. He doesn't trust me, she said. Dante doesn't trust anyone. It's why he's useful. Luca sat back down. You're moving out of your apartment tonight. What? The men who found you knew your schedule. They knew your route home, which means they know where you live. You're not going back. I can't just... I have a lease. I have things. Things can be replaced. You can't. You don't get to decide where I live. The words came out before she could filter them. Raw, angry, fueled by the same desperate fury that had driven her back to work the day after being beaten unconscious. The fury of someone who had been pushed around by systems and men and institutions for so long that even kindness, when it came wrapped in authority, felt like another form of control. Luca's eyebrows lifted slightly. Not offended, surprised, like a chess player encountering a move he hadn't considered. You're right, he said. I don't. But the men who beat you will come back. Not because they want to hurt you again, because they want to see if I respond. If you're still walking around unprotected, the message they receive is that I didn't care enough to act, and that message gets people killed. Not just you. My people. My operations. Everyone connected to this building. He leaned forward. So I'm not deciding where you live. I'm telling you the facts. What you do with them is your choice. Amara looked at the windows. The rain had intensified again, sheets of water rippling down the glass and turning Chicago's skyline into an impressionist painting she didn't have the bandwidth to appreciate. Where would I go? I have a secured unit above this floor. Private entrance, separate elevator, 24-hour surveillance. You would stay there until the situation is resolved. Your penthouse? A unit in my building. Let's not dramatize. And what happens when the situation is resolved? I go back to mopping floors? Luca studied her. What do you want to happen? No one had asked her that in so long she didn't have an answer. Want was a luxury item she had removed from her inventory years ago, right around the time Marcus got sick and the hospital bills started arriving like artillery shells, one after another, each one blowing a new hole in the life she was barely maintaining. I want to not owe $147,000 to a hospital that let my brother die, she said. That's what I want. The number sat between them like a third person in the room. Luca didn't flinch, didn't react. $147,000 was probably what he spent on the bar cart in the corner. Your brother, he said. Marcus, 14 months ago. Burst appendix that went septic. He didn't go to the ER because he couldn't afford it. By the time they operated, she stopped. Her throat had closed without permission. She swallowed hard and pushed through it. He died on the table. They sent me the bill the same week they sent me his personal effects. A phone with a cracked screen and a wallet with $11 in it. Silence. I didn't come here for charity, Amar said. I didn't come here for rescue. I came because you put a note in my locker and I can't afford to lose this job. So tell me what you want from me and let me get back to work. Luca stood again. He walked to the bar cart, poured 2 fingers of something amber into a crystal glass, and set it on the edge of the desk closest to her. I want you alive, he said simply. Everything else is negotiable. Amara looked at the glass. She didn't drink. Not because she didn't want to, but because she needed to stay sharp, needed every nerve firing at full capacity in the presence of a man who could end her life with a phone call. Alive costs money, she said, not yours. Then whose? Mine. Luca returned to his chair. I'm going to make you an offer. You can accept it or reject it, and if you reject it, I will still ensure your safety because the attack on you was an attack on me. But the offer is better. He paused. Let the silence do the work. I need someone inside the lower floors, someone the executives don't notice, someone who hears what they say when they think nobody's listening. You've been doing that for 10 months without trying. Amara's stomach tightened. You want me to spy? I want you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing, cleaning, being invisible, and telling me what you hear. That's spying. That's survival, yours and mine. He folded his hands on the desk. In exchange, your brother's medical debt disappears. Tonight. All of it. And your salary triples. The number hit her like a physical blow. $147,000. Gone. The weight she had been carrying for 14 months, the weight that bent her spine and hollowed her face and kept her awake at 3 in the morning, doing math that never worked, gone. Just like that. Spoken into existence by a man for whom the amount was less than a rounding error. She should have said no. She knew that. Every instinct built from years of navigating systems designed to exploit vulnerable people screamed that this was the trap, the hook, the moment where the mouth of the machine opened wide and invited you inside with the promise of safety before the teeth closed. Nothing was free. Everything had a price, and prices set by men like Luca Moretti compounded in ways you couldn't see until it was too late. But Marcus's face floated behind her eyes. Not the dead face, the alive one. The one that laughed too loud at bad jokes and burned scrambled eggs every Sunday morning and called her Mara like it was a secret name only the two of them shared. That face had been erased by debt, by a system that charged $147,000 for the privilege of dying on an operating table while your sister worked 2 jobs 6 blocks away. Amara picked up the glass. She drank. The bourbon burned her cracked lip, and she didn't care. "If I do this," she said, "I answer to you. Not Dante. Not whoever else you have running around this building with guns and earpieces. You." Agreed. "And if I hear something I don't like, about you, about this company, about whatever it is you actually do on this floor, I walk. No consequences. No men in alleys." Luca's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Something closer to recognition. "Agreed. And you don't own me. This isn't whatever you're thinking, whatever you're used to with people you buy. I'm not buying you, Amara. I'm hiring you." It was the first time he had used her name. She hadn't told it to him. He had learned it the way men like him learned everything. Through channels she would never see, from sources she would never meet. Hearing her name in his mouth did something she wasn't prepared for. Something warm and unwelcome that spread through her chest and tangled with the pain from her fractured ribs until she couldn't distinguish one from the other. She set the glass down. "Then I accept." Luca nodded once. He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Send Dr. Carmine up, and have Marco prepare the 47th floor." He looked at Amara. "Tonight you rest. Tomorrow, a doctor I trust will examine your injuries properly, and the day after that—" His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Whatever he read drained something from his face. Not color exactly, but warmth. The human quality that had flickered into existence during their conversation retreated behind something older and harder. "The day after that," he said quietly, "we go to war." He turned the phone toward her. On the screen, a photograph. The loading dock of Blackthorn Tower, taken from above. A security camera angle she recognized. In the photograph, pinned to the service entrance door with a hunting knife, was a dead rat. And around its neck, a handwritten note. The words were visible even in the grainy image. "We know she's still inside." Amar's blood went cold. Luca's eyes met hers across the desk. The warmth was gone entirely now. What looked back at her was the man Chicago whispered about. The one who made politicians tremble and rivals disappear. The one whose name alone carried the weight of a threat. "They're already watching the building," he said, "which means you were followed tonight. Which means they know you came to this floor." He stood. "Which means, as of right now, you don't leave this tower." The rain hammered the windows like fists. Amara sat in the leather chair with bourbon burning in her stomach and the photograph burning in her mind, and understood with absolute nauseating clarity that the door she had walked through tonight didn't open from the inside. She had made her choice, and now the choice owned her. 46 floors below, the city of Chicago churned in darkness and rain, and somewhere in that darkness, men with hunting knives and dead rats, and a grudge against the Moretti name were circling the building where Amara Vale had just traded one cage for another. Only this cage had better furniture and a view of the skyline, and a man with dead eyes sitting behind a mahogany desk who had just erased her brother's debt with less effort than it took her to mop a hallway. She didn't know yet what that would cost her, but she knew the bill was coming. It always did. The 47th floor had no name on any building directory. Amara learned this the next morning when she found a printed floor plan taped inside the kitchen cabinet. The kind of small orientation detail that suggested Luca had done this before, prepared spaces for people who arrived unexpectedly and stayed longer than they planned. The floor plan showed 3 rooms, a main living area, a bedroom, a bathroom. No office, no storage, nothing that suggested permanence. It was a holding space disguised as hospitality, and Amara recognized it for what it was even while she was grateful for the clean sheets and the shower pressure that actually worked. Dr. Carmine arrived at 8 in the morning. He was 60-something, small, with the unhurried manner of a man who had been treating injuries that couldn't be reported to authorities for long enough that the moral weight of it had compressed into something he simply carried without discussing. He brought a portable imaging unit in a leather case and set it up in the living area with the efficiency of someone assembling familiar furniture. He confirmed the 2 fractured ribs, the hairline fracture in her wrist, the concussion that she had been walking around with for 2 days. He prescribed real pain medication, fitted her with a proper wrist splint, and wrapped her ribs with medical-grade compression that was so much better than the dollar store bandage that she nearly wept from the simple relief of it. "You should rest for a week," he said while packing his case. "I'll rest for a day." He looked at her over the top of his glasses. "You're his problem, then." He left without saying whose problem he meant. She knew. Amara stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked at Chicago in gray morning light. From this height, the city looked orderly, rational, a grid of streets and buildings that implied system, logic, cause, and effect. It didn't look like a place where men pinned dead rats to service doors in the rain as territorial declarations. It didn't look like a place where hospitals billed the grieving for the privilege of watching someone die. But it was both those things simultaneously, and she had been living inside the second reality for so long that the first one felt like a television show she watched through glass. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her building superintendent and a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize. She didn't listen to it. Instead, she opened her banking app and stared at the balance for a long time, the way a person stares at a wound before pressing down. Then she refreshed the page. The balance had changed, not by the small increments she was used to, the tiny deposits from 2 jobs that barely kept her above zero. The number that looked back at her from the screen was so far outside her frame of reference that she read it 3 times before her brain accepted it. $40,000. Clean, direct deposit, no note. She sat down on the couch without deciding to. $40,000. Not the debt erasure, that would come separately, Luca had said, handled through whatever financial architecture men like him used to make problems disappear without paper trails. This was something else. This was the first payment, the beginning of what tripling her salary looked like in practice. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the first tremor of something colder, the understanding that the money was real, which meant the agreement was real, which meant she had actually done it, walked into a room with the most dangerous man in Chicago and handed him the leverage of her presence, her access, her silence, her invisibility, the one asset she had managed to preserve through 10 months of deliberate self-erasure. And he had bought it. She put the phone down face first on the cushion beside her. Luca came to the 47th floor at noon. He didn't knock. The door opened with a key card and he walked in wearing a different suit than the night before. Dark navy this time, white shirt, no tie, carrying 2 containers of food from somewhere that smelled like garlic and browned butter. He set them on the kitchen counter without ceremony. "Dr. Carmine's report," he said. "I know what it says. You have 2 fractured ribs and a concussion, and you've been working 16-hour shifts. I'm aware. For how long? Does it matter?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes," she told him. The double shifts, the laundromat mornings, the Blackthorn evenings, the 3 buses home at 4 in the morning. She told him because he was watching her with an expression that demanded specificity, and because something about the previous night had broken a seal she hadn't known she was maintaining. Once the bourbon was in her system and the agreement was made and the dead rat photograph had redrawn the geography of her situation, there was no performance left to maintain. Luca listened without interrupting. When she finished, he opened the food containers and put one in front of her without asking if she was hungry. He sat across the kitchen island from her with the other. Eat, he said. She ate. The food was extraordinary. Pasta with something rich and dark that she had no vocabulary for. And she was hungry enough that her body overrode the discomfort of eating in front of a man who still frightened her at a fundamental level. Luca ate across from her in silence. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of two strangers. It was something stranger. The silence of two people who had already established a transactional intimacy and were figuring out what lived on the other side of it. Dante found one of the guards, Luca said eventually. Amara looked up. The one who killed the camera feed. His name is Reyes. He's been on Blackthorn security for 3 years. He's been on Caruso's payroll for 2 of them. Did you... She stopped herself. Did I what? Nothing? Ask the question. Amara put her fork down. Did you hurt him? Luca's expression didn't shift. He was questioned. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have for you right now. He stood and took both containers to the counter. Reyes gave us a name. The men who attacked you work through a contractor Caruso uses for off-book operations. They're not soldiers. They're independent, hired specifically for the message. Where are they now? We're finding them. And when you find them? The question hung between them. Luca turned from the counter and looked at her with something close to patience, the kind that had been trained into a person through years of navigating conversations where the wrong answer destroyed things. What would you like me to do with them? He asked. She didn't have an answer for that either. She wanted to say turn them over to the police. She wanted to believe in that version of consequence. But she had grown up in a neighborhood where the police arrived late to everything and documented carefully and changed nothing. And she knew the men who had broken her ribs and pressed their boot onto her wrist would be back on a street corner before the paperwork dried. I want them to understand they made a mistake, she said finally. Luca nodded once. They already do. The afternoon passed in a strange suspension. Amara slept for 3 hours, the first real sleep she'd had since the alley, facilitated by the pain medication Dr. Carmine had left. When she woke, the light through the windows had turned amber, and the city below was beginning its evening transition, the daytime gray giving way to the electric glow of a million lit windows. She showered, changed into clothes that had been placed in the bedroom closet, all in her size, nothing ostentatious, practical items that suggested someone had gathered them quickly without trying to make a statement. She would examine the implications of that later. At 6 in the evening, a knock at the door. Not Luca. The man named Marco, younger, with a face that hadn't quite settled into adulthood yet, wearing a jacket that was too large across the shoulders in the way that meant it was concealing something. He held out a small device. A burner phone. Mr. Moretti says use this for building communication, not your personal phone. Why? Your personal phone has been compromised. Marco said it flatly, like reading a weather report. Someone put a tracking application on it 2 weeks ago. Amara's hand tightened around her regular phone in her pocket. 2 weeks? Yes. Before the alley? Yes. She thought about all the places she had been in the past 2 weeks. Her apartment, the laundromat, the routes between them. The 2 buses to Blackthorn, the 3 buses home. 14 days of movement, mapped and recorded and analyzed by someone she had never met for purposes that were designed to end with her broken in a wet alley. How did they get to my phone? She said. Marco shifted slightly. Uncomfortable. The discomfort of someone delivering information they hadn't been authorized to fully explain. Mr. Moretti will discuss that with you. Amara looked at him for a long moment. He knows. Marco said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She took the burner phone. Luca was not on the 47th floor. He was not on the 46th. Marco led her through a service corridor she hadn't seen before, a narrow utilitarian passage behind the paneled walls of the upper floors, to a room she hadn't known existed. Small, no windows. Concrete walls that the expensive wood paneling of the public-facing floor didn't quite reach. A table, 4 chairs, 2 computer monitors on a fold-out stand, a coffee maker that smelled burned. Dante was already inside. He looked up when she entered and something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite hostility. Something in between. the expression of a man who had been expecting this moment and had not been able to decide how to hold himself in it. Luca stood at the monitors. He turned when Amara walked in. "Close the door," he said to Marco. The door closed. Amara looked at the monitors. One displayed a freeze-frame image from a security camera. The other displayed a spreadsheet she couldn't read from the doorway. "Your phone," Luca said. "The tracking application was installed 22 days ago. We traced the installation to a device on Blackthorn's internal network, specifically to a workstation on the 44th floor." He paused. "The executive suite." Amara didn't respond. She was looking at Dante. Dante was not looking back. "The workstation is registered to the Chief Operations Officer," Luca continued, "Richard Hale. He's been at Blackthorn for 7 years. In that time, he has had 17 private communications with a financial shell company registered in Delaware that functions as a front for Caruso's domestic operations." He turned fully toward Amara. "Richard Hale is the one who told Caruso about you. He provided your schedule, your route home, your phone number, your address. He was the one who flagged you as an accessible target, a person who could be touched without immediate consequence." The words landed one at a time, each one slightly heavier than the last. Amara thought about Richard Hale. She knew his face the way she knew all of them, from below, essentially, from the angle of a person cleaning beneath the table where important men sat. He was 50-ish, salt and pepper, wore the same brand of watch every day, left his coffee cup in the center of the conference table instead of at his seat because he expected someone else to move it. He had walked past her 100 times. She had cleaned up after him for 10 months. He had handed her address to men with boots and broken ribs. "Where is he?" she said. "In the building," Luca said. "He doesn't know we know." "Why hasn't—" She stopped herself again. Reorganized the question. "What are you waiting for?" "Information," Luca said. "Hale isn't the source. He's a conduit. Someone higher than Caruso is coordinating this, someone with enough reach to compromise a 7-year Blackthorn executive without our security detecting it for 22 days. Hale is a thread. We follow the thread." Amara turned to Dante. She wasn't sure why. Something about the way he was standing, the particular angle of a person who was braced against impact. "You knew," she said. The room went very still. Dante's jaw tightened. "I found out 40 minutes ago." "That's not what I said. I said you knew." She held his eyes. "When Luca brought me up here 2 nights ago, you called me expendable. And then you looked at me like—" She searched for the word. "Like I was a complication." "You are a complication." "Dante." Luca's voice was quiet. Warning. "She's right to ask," Dante said, suddenly sharp, turning toward Luca with an energy that rewired the room entirely. "She's right to ask because this whole situation is a complication, and I have been trying to manage it cleanly. Hale has been flagged on my internal watch list for 8 weeks. 8. I've been building a case, documenting the shell company transfers, mapping the communication patterns. And now you're... He stopped, pressed his mouth shut. Silence. 8 weeks, Luca said. I didn't have confirmation. I needed confirmation before I brought it to you. You needed 8 weeks to confirm a 7-year executive was running information to a rival operation. I needed 8 weeks to confirm it cleanly enough that when I told you, nobody could call it a personal agenda. And in those 8 weeks, Luca said, his voice dropping to the specific register that seemed to lower the room temperature as a physical effect, someone used the information Hale was providing to identify, surveil, track, and assault a person under the protection of this organization. She wasn't under protection when it happened. She works in my building. She has been under protection since the day she walked through the service entrance. You know that. Dante said nothing. His hands were at his sides and his face had gone to stone, but his breathing had changed, faster, slightly, the almost invisible sign of a man who is holding himself in by the thinnest of margins. Amara watched the two of them. The architecture of it was becoming visible to her in real time. The structure beneath the structure, the way it worked. Dante had known about Hale and had deliberately delayed reporting it, had been building his own case, managing his own timeline, maintaining his control over the flow of information to Luca. Whether that was institutional caution or something worse. She couldn't tell yet. But the delay had cost her 2 fractured ribs and a wrist that still throbbed under the new splint. "You built a case for 8 weeks," she said to Dante, "and you never thought to tell the woman working night shifts in the building that she might be being watched. You weren't a factor in my calculus. That keeps being the problem, doesn't it?" The bluntness of it surprised him. She could see that. His eyes moved to her face with a new quality. Not the dismissive scan from their first meeting, but something that was actually reading her, recalibrating. Luca let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. Then he moved. He walked to the door, opened it, and spoke into the corridor. Amara couldn't hear the words. He returned and sat in one of the chairs with the deliberate posture of a man who had made a decision and was settling into its weight. "Dante," he said, "you will take your documentation on Hale and submit it to me in the next 4 hours. All of it. Every communication log, every transfer record, every piece of material you've been building for 8 weeks. Tonight." Dante looked at him. "And my position?" "Your position is exactly as precarious as your judgment in this situation warrants, which is a conversation for after we resolve the active threat." Luca's eyes were flat. 4 hours. Dante left. The door closed, and this time the click sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Amara and Luca were alone in the small windowless room with the burned coffee smell and the humming monitors. "He's not the traitor," Luca said. "I know, but he protected his investigation over the security of someone in this building." "Yes, he did." Luca looked at her. "Does that distinction matter to you?" "It matters for what he is. It doesn't help my wrist." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, more like the recognition of a person who said true things without dressing them up. "No," he said, "it doesn't." He turned back to the monitors. His hands moved across a keyboard briefly. The spreadsheet on the second monitor shifted, replaced by a new image, a photograph of a building exterior. Industrial. A warehouse near what looked like a river dock. "Caruso's men, the 2 who were in the alley with you, we found them this morning." He tapped the screen. "They're here, waiting for word from Caruso about whether the message was received, whether I reacted. And you haven't reacted. Not visibly. I needed to know the full shape of this before I moved." "What's the full shape?" Luca was quiet for a moment. His eyes stayed on the monitor, but the focus had moved inward, the way people looked when they were organizing information that had multiple levels simultaneously. "Caruso doesn't have the resources to plant a mole inside Blackthorn for 7 years, he said. "He doesn't have the financial network to maintain the shell company infrastructure Hale was using. He doesn't have the intelligence capacity to identify and surveil a specific maintenance employee and coordinate a targeted assault within the window of a building security blind spot." He looked at Amara. "Caruso is being funded, directed, by someone who has been building a case against my operation for a very long time, using Caruso as a proxy, using Hale as an internal source, using you." He paused, and the pause had weight, "as a test. A test to see how I respond to direct provocation, whether I act emotionally, whether I expose my networks trying to protect someone I shouldn't have noticed." Amara stared at him. The cold that had been circling her since the alley moved closer, settled. "And have you," she said, "acted emotionally?" Luca held her gaze without answering, which was its own kind of answer. "Who's behind Caruso?" she said. He turned back to the monitor. "Until 40 minutes ago, I had a theory. Then Dante's documentation confirmed it." He pulled up a new file. A photograph. A man she didn't recognize. Older, distinguished in the way that expensive suits and old money could manufacture. The kind of face she associated with the board members downstairs, except with more weight behind the eyes. "His name is Victor Strand. He is the majority shareholder of 2 of Blackthorn's largest institutional investors, which means, through a chain of holding companies, he has had indirect financial leverage over this organization for 4 years. Who is he? He ran the East Coast distribution network before I consolidated it. He lost significant territory, significant income. He's been patient." Luca's jaw tightened. 4 years of patient. "And the attack on me. was designed to make me move quickly, emotionally, expose my resources, my loyalties, my response protocols. Instead, I brought you inside, which is either very smart or very stupid, depending on what Strand does next. Amara looked at the man's photograph. Victor Strand? Patient. Funded. Intelligent enough to architect a 4-year play against someone as formidable as Luca Moretti, and precise enough to identify a janitor as a useful instrument. He knows I'm up here, she said. Almost certainly. Which means Hale has reported it. Yes. She turned away from the monitor, walked to the far wall. The concrete was cold through her sleeve when she leaned against it. She stared at the floor. Institutional gray, nothing like the polished marble of the public floors, just raw material beneath the surface of the building everyone could see. You used me, she said. Luca was quiet. Not the way they did, but you made me visible. You brought me upstairs. You paid off my brother's debt, and you tripled my salary, and you put me in a secured unit, and every single one of those things is a signal that Strand can read. You made me into a statement. I made you safe. You made me a piece. She turned around. Her voice was level. Not angry. Worse than angry. Precise. You moved me to a position on the board without asking if I wanted to be on the board. And now Strand knows exactly where I am, which means the alley wasn't the end of the danger. It was the beginning. Luca stood. He crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped close enough that she could see the tension he kept below the surface of his control. The vein at his jaw, the slight flare at his nostrils, the hands that were very carefully not clenched. What I did, he said quietly, was the only thing I could do. Leaving you unprotected after the attack would have told Strand that you mean nothing to me, which would have made you disposable, which would have meant Caruso's men coming back to finish what they started. And bringing me upstairs tells Strand I mean something to you, which makes me a target for different reasons. Yes. So there was no version where I was safe? No. The honesty of it was unexpectedly brutal. She had expected deflection, justification, the smooth language of a man used to constructing narratives around his decisions. Instead, he gave her the raw answer, stripped of everything. Then what, she said, do you need from me? Right now. Not the agreement, not the long game. Right now. Luca reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small device on the table beside her. Flat. Black. Smaller than her phone. Richard Hale, he said, has a meeting tomorrow morning. 38th floor conference room B alone. He thinks it's a routine budget review. His computer will be open. His phone will be on the table. Luca's eyes didn't waver. I need someone who has a reason to be in that room. Someone with a passkey and a cart and a uniform that makes her invisible. Amara looked at the device. What does it do? It mirrors his phone in 30 seconds. Everything. Contacts, communications, financial applications, all of it transferred to our servers. And if he recognizes me, he won't. You've cleaned that room while he was in it 11 times in the past 3 months. She looked up at him. He was right. She had. And Hale had never once looked at her face. She picked up the device. It was lighter than she expected. Lighter than the choice it represented, which was not cleaning a conference room at midnight while the building slept, but actively participating in the operation of a man who disposed of rivals in dock warehouses and had enemies patient enough to spend 4 years dismantling him from the inside. She had crossed a line by coming to this floor. She understood now that this small black device in her hand, this room, this conversation, was a different line entirely, the kind you don't notice until you're already on the other side of it. Tomorrow morning, she said, 7:30, before the building populates. She nodded. She put the device in her uniform pocket, and the thing she felt was not fear exactly. Fear she knew. Fear was the boot on her wrist, and the cold rain on her face, and the hospital bill arriving in the same envelope as her brother's personal effects. Fear was the shape of her life before this building, before this floor, before a man with cold eyes had looked at her bruised face across a boardroom and asked, "Who touched you?" Like the answer was going to matter. This was something else. This was the particular sensation of a person who has been watching the machinery operate from outside, finally stepping inside. Feeling the gears, feeling the heat, knowing with complete clarity that the machinery does not care about the people it processes, and choosing to reach into it anyway, because the alternative is standing outside in the cold with fractured ribs and a dead brother's debt, and the unshakable knowledge that the world you lived in was never going to adjust itself to account for. She did not sleep. 47th floor was quiet and climate-controlled, and the bed was the most expensive surface she had ever lain on. And none of it mattered because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the device on the table. Small and black and light as a stone, you could skip across water before it sank to the bottom and stayed there forever. At 5:15 in the morning, Amara got up, dressed in her uniform, and stood at the windows watching Chicago come back to life below. The city did not care what she was about to do. The city was already moving. Delivery trucks on the lower streets, the elevated train bleeding light across the dark grid, somewhere below a siren starting and stopping like a thought abandoned mid-sentence. She drank coffee from the machine in the kitchen. Black. Her ribs ached at a manageable level, the medication Dr. Carmine prescribed doing the structural work of keeping her functional. Her wrist was stiff inside the splint. She flexed her fingers one at a time, testing the range, calculating what she could carry and how fast she could move if she needed to move fast. She was doing this. She had already decided. She pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass and looked at the reflection staring back at her. A woman in a gray maintenance uniform with a fading bruise on her cheekbone and eyes that had gone somewhere new in the past 48 hours. Somewhere that didn't have a name yet. Somewhere past the point where she recognized the version of herself who had pushed a cart through this building for 10 months without asking a single question that mattered. That woman was gone. She wasn't sure what had replaced her. At 6:45, she took the service corridor to the freight elevator, loaded her cart, and descended to the 38th floor. The building was beginning to populate. Security shift change at 7. The lobby receptionist arriving, hanging up her coat, starting the coffee machine at the welcome desk. A handful of early executives in the elevator bank, eyes on phones, breathing recycled air without noticing it. Nobody looked at the woman with the maintenance cart. Nobody ever did. Conference room B was at the east end of the 38th floor corridor. A glass-walled room with a mahogany table that seated 8. She had cleaned it 40, 50 times. She knew the exact angle at which the morning light came through the east-facing windows. Knew that the third chair from the left had a wheel that stuck on the carpet seam. Knew the cabinet beneath the credenza held spare presentation remotes and a power strip, and for reasons she had never investigated, a single golf ball. At 7:10, the room was empty. She went in, cleaned the table, wiped the credenza, restocked the water glasses from her cart with movements so practiced they required no conscious direction. Her hands worked while her mind stayed very still, the way she had trained it during the worst months after Marcus died. Not dissociation exactly, more like the deliberate compartmentalization of a person who understood that feeling, everything simultaneously, was a form of paralysis she could not afford. At 7:22, Richard Hale walked in. He was wearing the same brand of watch, a blue suit she hadn't seen before. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and a phone in his other hand, and he was reading something on the screen as he walked, his thumbs scrolling, his face arranged in the mild concentration of a man processing routine information. He sat down at the far end of the table. He did not look at Amara. She was beside the credenza, refilling the small ceramic dish of mints that nobody ever ate, her back partially turned, her cart between her body and the table. Standard position. Standard invisibility. Hale put his phone face up on the table. He opened his leather portfolio, retrieved a pen, began reviewing printed documents, making small notations in the margins. His breathing was even. His posture was relaxed. He had the physical ease of a man who had been carrying a dangerous secret for 2 years and had made sufficient internal peace with it that it no longer registered as weight. Amara moved the cart one step to the left. Her hand found the device in her pocket. It was smaller than she remembered, or maybe her hand was less steady than she'd tested in the apartment this morning. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, which was new. She didn't normally feel her pulse in her fingertips. She slid the device into her palm and covered it with a folded cleaning cloth, the way Luca had shown her, and took 2 steps toward the far end of the credenza, which put her 6 feet from where Hale's phone lay face up on the table. She needed 4 feet. She needed 4 feet and 30 seconds, and for Richard Hale to keep his eyes on his portfolio. She crouched to the cabinet beneath the credenza, opened it, retrieved the spare power strip she already knew was inside, and began the performance of checking the cable connections with the unhurried competence of someone performing a routine task. Her head was down. Her left hand worked the cables. Her right hand, under the cloth, moved the device into position. 4 feet. She straightened slowly, moved toward the table end, reaching across to check the power connection at the credenza unit. Her right hand, still covered by the cloth, passed within range. She pressed the device against the underside of the table edge nearest to Hale's phone. A single vibration in her palm, barely perceptible, less than a heartbeat. Contact. She counted. Not in her head. She couldn't trust her head, which was running too fast and in too many directions simultaneously. She counted in her chest, feeling the seconds like a physical measure of space between her body and the moment this either worked or collapsed. 1. Hale turned a page in his portfolio. 10. He made a notation. His pen scratched paper. Outside the glass wall, the corridor was beginning to fill. 2 people passing, a phone conversation in fragments, the distant chime of an elevator. 20. Hale reached for his coffee cup. Drank. Set it back down. 27. His eyes moved up from the portfolio, not toward her, toward the glass wall, tracking something in the corridor. His head turned a fraction. 29. 30. She pulled the device back under the cloth and straightened, stepping away from the table in the same unhurried motion she used every time she moved in a room where important men worked. Her heart was doing something she didn't have a clinical term for. Not racing. The opposite. A heavy, deliberate pounding, like something trying to break through concrete from the inside. Hale's eyes returned to his portfolio. He had not looked at her once. She pushed her cart toward the door, turned at the threshold, and said the thing maintenance workers said when leaving a room with an occupant. "All set in here. Have a good morning." Hale made a vague acknowledging sound without raising his head. She left. In the corridor, she walked at her standard pace. No faster, no slower. Past the elevator bank, past the assistant pool that was beginning to fill with people settling into chairs and logging into computers, past the small kitchen where someone had started a fresh pot, and the smell of coffee hit her like something almost normal, almost belonging to the version of her life that existed before all of this. She turned the corner into the supply corridor and stopped, pressed her back against the wall. Her legs gave out enough that she was leaning against the concrete block with her full body weight, the cart handle still in her right hand, the device in her left, and the compressed breath of the past 4 minutes finally leaving her in one long, unsteady exhale that she absolutely could not afford to let anyone hear. Her ribs screamed. She had been holding herself rigid without realizing it, bracing her torso against the possibility of sudden movement, and now the fractured bones were reminding her precisely what she had done to them. She pressed her forearm over her left side and breathed through it. In, out. Small increments. The device vibrated once. Complete. She looked at the burner phone Marco had given her. A single message from a number stored as a single letter. L. Done. Come up. She pushed off the wall, straightened her spine, adjusted her grip on the cart handle, and walked to the freight elevator like a woman who had just completed a routine morning task, because that was what she was now. A woman for whom this was routine. Whether she had decided that or it had been decided for her, she could no longer clearly identify the seam between those two things. And she filed that thought in the same place she filed everything that couldn't be processed while the machinery was running. Later. Everything later. Luca was at the monitors in the windowless room when she arrived. Marco was beside him. A third man she hadn't seen before sat at a separate keyboard, working with the speed of someone who understood code the way musicians understood scales, instinctively, physically. Amara placed the device on the table. Luca picked it up, handed it to the third man without looking away from the monitor. "Clean transfer?" he said. "Full contact. 32 seconds." The third man plugged the device into a port on his laptop and began working. The room was quiet except for the keyboard and the climate hum. Marco stood with his arms crossed, watching the screen with an expression of focused neutrality. Luca turned to Amara. He looked at her face the same way he had looked at it on the 44th floor 2 nights ago, cataloging what was written there. She kept her face arranged around nothing, around function. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. "I'm fine." "Sit down." "I don't need—" "Amara." The quietness of it was absolute. "Sit down." She sat. The third man, she later learned his name was Chen, just Chen, worked for 22 minutes. In those 22 minutes, Amara drank the burned coffee that Marco poured without asking if she wanted it, and she looked at the concrete wall, and she thought about Marcus in the non-destructive way she had slowly learned to do over 14 months. Not the dying part, just the living part, the loud laugh and the burned eggs, and the cracked screen phone with $11 in the wallet, and the particular way he used to tip his head back when something genuinely surprised him, like the world kept managing to exceed his expectations despite all available evidence. "Here," Chen said. The monitor changed. What populated the screen was not what any of them expected. Amara could tell by the way Luca went still. Not the controlled stillness he usually maintained, but a different kind. The kind that happened when information arrived that was heavier than your framework for receiving it. He leaned forward slowly. His hands moved to the edge of the table and stayed there. "That's not Caruso's network," Marco said. "No," Chen said. "It's not." The financial data on the screen was dense. Account numbers, transfer histories, shell company chains folding into each other like origami. But even Amara, with no training in this kind of architecture, could see the shape of it. The money moved in one direction, always toward the same terminus. A holding company in the Caymans that nested inside a trust that nested inside a Delaware LLC that, when Chen pulled up its registration documentation, resolved into a name on the board of Blackthorn Global Holdings, not Victor Strand. One of the 12 men who had been sitting at the 44th floor conference table 2 nights ago, frozen in their chairs when Luca walked in. Thomas Reeve, Chief Financial Officer. The voice she had heard in the corridor 10 months ago, talking about Moretti and port deals and federal attention in the casual conspiratorial tone of a man who believed himself untouchable inside his own walls. The man who had walked past her cart 400 times. "Reeve," Luca said. The name sat in the room like something dropped from a significant height. "Reeve has been managing the financial bridge between Strand and Caruso for 3 years, Chen said, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone delivering a technical briefing, keeping himself clear of the emotional weather building in the room. The Hale connection is secondary. Hale was receiving operational direction through Reeve. Reeve is the architect." Marco uncrossed his arms. "He's been in that building for 11 years. "He's been in Strand's pocket for at least 7, Chen said. Luca stepped back from the table, turned, walked to the far wall, which was bare concrete, and stood facing it for 4 seconds. The back of his neck had gone tight. She could see the tension from across the room, the way it climbed from his collar into his jawline. Then he turned back. "Where's Reeve now?" "Building," Marco said. "He came in at 7:05. He's in his office." "And Strand?" Chen typed. "Checked something. His last registered location is a hotel downtown, the Meridian. Checked in 2 days ago." The timing landed. 2 days ago was the night of the dead rat photograph. The night Amara had sat in the leather chair in Luca's office and made her agreement. Strand had been in the city, a mile from this building, the whole time. Luca looked at Amara. Something in the look was different from every previous time he had looked at her in this building. Before, even at the beginning, even in the first moment he crouched beside her in the boardroom, there had been an asymmetry in his gaze, the way powerful people looked at people without power, a fundamental difference in visual register, assessment, calculation, decision from above. This was not that. This was the look of a person who had run out of a particular kind of insulation and was standing exposed in territory he hadn't planned for. "Strand is here because of you," Amara said. "He came to watch how you responded." "Yes." "Which means he's going to act soon because you've already responded. He can read everything you've done in the past 48 hours. "Yes." So whatever he's planning, it's already in motion. Luca turned to Marco. Get Dante. Dante's not Get him! Marco left. The room reduced to 3 people, 2 monitors, the burned coffee smell, and the architecture of a situation that had been building for 4 years and was now collapsing into a single point with the specific velocity of something that had been patient long enough. Dante arrived in 4 minutes. He had the look of a man who had not slept, not the dramatic dishevelment of movies, but the subtle version, the micro-dullness behind the eyes, the 5 o'clock shadow that had moved into something less intentional. He looked at the monitors, read the financial data, read Reeve's name. His face went somewhere complicated. You knew about Reeve, Luca said. I suspected Dante. A pause. The specific pause of someone who has been caught in the architecture of their own careful deception and is calculating whether the truth costs more than the lie at this exact point. I had circumstantial material on Reeve 6 weeks ago, Dante said. Nothing actionable. If I had moved on it prematurely, 6 weeks ago, Luca said, Hale had been active for 22 days, which means when you had circumstantial material on Reeve, you also had sufficient pattern to identify Hale as his instrument, which means you could have flagged the surveillance risk to anyone in this building who might be... He stopped. The room understood the end of the sentence without it being spoken. Dante's jaw worked. I was protecting the investigation. You were protecting your position within it. Luca's voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard before. Not louder, lower. The specific frequency of a man who was past anger and standing in the colder territory that came after it. You wanted to be the person who brought me Reeve, cleanly, comprehensively, with your name attached to every piece of documentation, because that would have been a significant consolidation of your standing in this organization. Dante said nothing. And to protect that outcome, you accepted a delay that exposed a civilian in this building to targeted physical violence. I didn't know they would. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't ask because asking would have required sharing partial information, which would have diluted your position. Luca stepped toward him. Not threatening exactly, something more controlled than threatening. I have trusted you for 7 years, Dante. I have trusted your judgment in matters of significant consequence. Tell me why I should continue to do that. The silence was the longest one in a room full of long silences. Because I'm the best you have, Dante said. Quietly, without bravado. Just the flat statement of a person who believed a true thing even about themselves at their worst. Luca held his eyes for a long moment. Then he turned away. Reeve is in his office, Luca said. Strand is at the Meridian. Both of them know that the timeline is collapsing. The moment Hale realizes his phone was mirrored, they will know we have the financial data. We have hours. Less, possibly. What's the play? Marco said. The shareholder summit, Chen said from the monitors. Everyone looked at him. Chen turned in his chair. He had the manner of someone who spent most of his time with machines and had learned to deliver human information with the same directness. Blackthorn's annual shareholder summit is scheduled for this Friday, the 44th floor conference hall, 230 executives, board members, and institutional investors. Strand has a reservation at the Meridian through Saturday. He paused. Strand was never planning to leave before the summit. The room reconfigured around that information. Amara felt it shift, the specific sensation of a picture gaining its final detail, the surrounding image suddenly legible because the center had resolved. Victor Strand hadn't come to Chicago to watch Luca's response and leave. He had come because the summit was 3 days away, and the summit was the event, the moment, the culmination of 4 years of architecture. He's going to move at the summit, she said. Luca looked at her, didn't contradict it. Publicly, she continued. That's why the timing of the attack on me, the timing of him checking into the hotel, it's all pressure. He's been applying pressure to force a reaction from you before the summit, something he can use, something visible. Because at the summit, in front of every institutional investor Blackthorn has, he needs a narrative. He needs to demonstrate that I'm a liability, Luca said, that the organization is unstable, that the violence of the past week is symptomatic of leadership that can't control its own territory. He uses the summit to move against me through the board. A legitimate hostile takeover, Dante said. The word legitimate carrying a particular weight in a room like this. It can't be stopped legally, Chen said. He has the shareholding infrastructure in place. If he presents the board with a credible case for instability, supported by Reeves' internal testimony, documented through Hale's communications, framed by whatever he's been building for 4 years, the board votes Luca out and Strand walks in through the front door with a tie and a press release. Amara looked at Luca. He was standing in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man doing structural calculations under enormous pressure, measuring load-bearing walls in the dark, estimating which ones could come down without bringing the whole thing with them. "Reeve," she said. Luca's eyes moved to her. "Reeve has to testify against you for Strand's case to hold. Without internal board testimony, Strand's financial data is circumstantial." She felt herself thinking faster than she had thought in years, her mind operating on fuel she hadn't known she had stockpiled. But Reeve is the CFO. He controls the shareholder summit's financial presentation. He controls the documents that go out to investors beforehand. He controls the narrative architecture of the entire event. Yes. Then you can't remove him before the summit. If Reeve disappears in the next 48 hours, Strand accelerates, moves earlier, changes the play. Also yes. So Reeve has to be there, at the summit, in his chair. She paused. The room was listening in a way rooms rarely listened. But the documents he presents don't have to be his. The silence that followed was different from the others. Productive. The kind of silence that comes when a room full of people arrive at the same point from different directions and find each other there. Dante looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not dismissal, not resentment. Something grudging and specific. "That requires access to Reeves' document architecture before Friday," he said. "Chen can do it," she said. "He just mirrored Hale's phone in 30 seconds with a device the size of a thumb drive." Chen turned back to his keyboard with the micro-expression of someone given a problem they find interesting. "I need Reeves' credentials. Active session access, not just archived data." "He's in his office right now," Marco said. Everyone understood what that meant. Amara reached into her uniform pocket. She pulled out the cleaning cloth. It had her fingerprints on it and the ghost of a transfer operation that had just changed the shape of everything in this building. She put it on the table. "I need a different device," she said to Chen. "And I need to know where Reeve keeps his laptop." Amara, Luca started. "He won't look at me," she said. "He hasn't looked at me in 10 months. He is not going to start today." She looked at Luca directly, holding the eye contact with the steadiness of a person who had stopped being afraid of what she might find looking back. "You know I'm right." The muscle at his jaw worked. He knew. Chen was already pulling a second device from his case. Marco was pulling up the 38th floor layout on the second monitor, enlarging the section showing the CFO's office, noting the camera positions and the desk orientation and the window angle, with the professional focus of someone who planned things that required that level of detail. Dante moved to the door, stopped, turned back. He looked at Amara. 4 full seconds. "Don't get caught," he said. It was not an apology. It was not an endorsement. It was something in the territory between them. An acknowledgement from a man who had decided, in the limited vocabulary available to him, to move from one position to another. She nodded once. He left. Amara turned back to Chen and held out her hand for the second device and the briefing on Reeves' office layout and whatever additional information would give her the next 30 seconds she needed. The next 30 seconds inside which everything would either hold together or come completely apart, and the answer to which would determine not just the fate of a corporation or a mafia empire or a 4-year hostile architecture, but the specific future of a woman who had started this week with a janitor's cart and fractured ribs and a dead brother's debt and had arrived, through a sequence of choices that started with a note in a locker and ended in a windowless room smelling of burned coffee, at the precise center of a war she had never agreed to fight. But here she was, and the device was in her hand. And somewhere 1 floor below, in a CFO's office, with a laptop open and a phone on the desk, Thomas Reeve was reviewing documents for a shareholder summit that was 3 days away. A summit designed to destroy the only man who had looked at her bruised face and asked who touched you like the answer mattered. Unaware that the woman he had passed 400 times in the corridor, without once registering her face, was about to walk through his door with a cart and a cleaning cloth in 30 seconds of... Thomas Reeve did not look up when she entered. He was at his desk with his laptop open and his reading glasses pushed to the end of his nose and a half-eaten breakfast sandwich going cold on the corner of a leather blotter that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. The office smelled like coffee and the particular kind of male authority that came from 11 years in the same chair. Accumulated certainty, the residue of 1,000 decisions made without consequence catching up. Amara pushed the cart through the door with the specific energy of someone performing the 43rd iteration of a routine task. Not hurried, not hesitant, the exact pace of a person for whom this room was a box to be serviced and vacated. "Morning check," she said to the room generally. Reeve made the sound, the same vague, acknowledging sound that Hale had made, the sound that meant you are furniture and I am processing other things, and your presence is registered only to the extent that it produces no friction. She moved to the credenza along the left wall, began the same sequence she had built with Hale: spray, wipe, methodical, unhurried. Her left hand working the cleaning cloth, her right hand finding the device in her pocket with the muscle memory of something she had done once and would apparently do again because this was what she was now. A woman who did this, who walked into rooms and took things from powerful men who had never looked at her face. Reeve's laptop was open on the desk at a 60-degree angle to his body, screen facing slightly away from her. His phone was face down beside it, a different habit than Hale, less relaxed, the phone placement of someone who had reasons for not wanting their screen visible. She needed 6 feet. She needed 6 feet and a reason to cross them, and 30 seconds, and for the breakfast sandwich not to require his attention in the next half minute. She crouched to the cabinet beneath the credenza, retrieved the power strip, began checking connections. The position gave her an angle on Reeve's desk she didn't have standing. She could see the laptop screen from here. Document open, dense with figures, the preliminary financial presentation for the shareholder summit. Reeve's work, Reeve's architecture, the narrative he had been building for Strand. She stood, moved the cart 3 feet toward the desk. Standard repositioning. She needed access to the trash can beside the desk, which was her reason for closing the distance, which was true, which was also the precise location that put her within range. Reeve reached for his coffee without looking up. She lifted the trash can with her left hand. The device in her right, covered by the cloth, passed beneath the edge of the desk, contacted the surface of Reeve's phone through the case and the cloth with the lightest possible pressure. 1. Reeve set the coffee cup down. 10. He turned a page in the document beside his laptop. The paper sound was very loud in the quiet office. 20. Amara replaced the empty trash bag from her cart, tied the top, dropped it into the bin of the cart. Standard finish, standard exit motion, her body continuing the performance on autopilot while the calculation ran beneath. 28, 29. Reeve said, "You." Her blood stopped. Not cold, just stopped. The sensation of circulation pausing mid-beat, like a clock whose spring has been wound too tight and finally slipped a gear. She turned. Reeve had removed his glasses. He was looking at her. Not the way he looked at furniture. Something different. Something that had come online behind his eyes with a quality she could not immediately read. Recognition, possibly, or the precursor to it. 30. She felt the device complete its cycle against her palm. "Sir?" she said. Reeve's eyes moved over her face. The bruise was fading but still visible, the greenish yellow of a contusion entering its final phase. Her wrist splint was partially visible below her uniform sleeve. He was reading these details with the expression of a man who had been in close proximity to violence for years without ever being its immediate subject, and therefore recognized its marks with a specific detached familiarity. "You're the one they brought upstairs," he said. The room reconfigured. Amara held very still. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "You work the overnight shift. You've been here 10 months. Reeves set his glasses on the desk. His voice was level, conversational, the voice of a man who was buying time while making a calculation of his own. Moretti moved you to the 47th floor 3 days ago. I stay in building housing when my schedule runs late. It's a company. Don't. Reeves said it quietly, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than hostility would have been. I've been in this building for 11 years. I know what the 47th floor is used for. Silence. Reeve leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man walking through a decision in real time, each step visible if you knew what to look for. How much did he tell you? Reeve asked. I clean floors. How much? The second time it had weight, not threatening. The weight of someone who had decided something and needed to orient themselves within that decision before it became irrevocable. Amara looked at him. Looked at the man who had given her address to men with boots and hunting knives, who had sat across from her in this building for 10 months at the far end of tables she cleaned while she was invisible, who had, in the most bureaucratic possible way, tried to have her used up and discarded as a piece in a game she didn't know she was on the board of. Enough, she said. Reeve nodded slowly. He looked at his laptop screen for a moment, then at his phone, which was face down on the desk, with the expression of a man who has not yet realized that the surface reality of an object can be completely independent of what's happening inside it. He's going to come after me, Reeve said, before Friday. I wouldn't know. Yes, you would. He looked back at her. You're not a janitor anymore. I don't know what you are, but you walked in here to do something, and whatever it was, it's done. So, he folded his hands on the desk. Tell me what I need to do. The question was extraordinary in its simplicity, not a man negotiating for his survival in the theatrical sense, a man who had looked at the arithmetic of his situation, found the sum unacceptable, and was asking the only person currently in the room for a practical alternative. Amara put the cleaning cloth on her cart. She looked at Thomas Reeve, at his half-eaten sandwich, and his expensive blotter, and his face that showed its age in the particular way of men who had spent years doing wrong things at high altitude, where the air was thin enough that the moral damage showed up as a physical weariness around the eyes. Strand, she said. He's the one you're actually afraid of. Reeve's jaw tightened. You've been inside this for 3 years, she said, and at some point in those 3 years you realized that Strand wasn't going to let you retire cleanly, that the documentation he has on you is a permanent leash, not a temporary arrangement. Reeve said nothing. Give us Strand, she said. Everything. Communications, directives, the full financial architecture. Whatever you have that connects him directly to the operation, not through Caruso, not through shell companies, him. That's a death sentence. The alternative is we present what we already have at the shareholder summit in front of 200 witnesses and let the board vote on whether the CFO has been running a hostile financial operation inside his own company for 3 years. She held his gaze. Which version ends better for you? The clock on Reeve's wall marked the seconds. He reached for his phone. Not because she had told him to, because the arithmetic had completed itself and the sum was what it was, and Thomas Reeve, for all his damage, was not a man who would die on principle for Victor Strand. He turned the phone face up. He looked at it for a moment. Then he slid it across the desk toward Amara and said, The passcode is 8472. Tell Moretti I want terms in writing, through a lawyer, tonight. Amara picked up the phone. She put it in her pocket alongside the device. She pushed her cart to the door. At the threshold, she stopped. She didn't know why. Some pull she couldn't name. Not compassion exactly. Something more like the specific acknowledgement of a person who had cleaned up after this man for 10 months and was only now seeing him clearly. Your breakfast is cold, she said. Reeve looked at her. She left. The next 48 hours moved with the compressed intensity of a situation in its final phase. The period when all the accumulated pressure of a long building system finally converts to velocity, and everything happens in a fraction of the time it took to construct. Chen worked through the night with Reeve's phone data and Hale's mirrored files in his own tools, building the document architecture that would replace Reeve's summit presentation from the inside. Not falsified material, actual Blackthorn financial records, clean and accurate, with the shadow network stripped out and the legitimate operation isolated and presented in a format that institutional investors could read without Strand's interpretive overlay. Dante coordinated what needed to be coordinated in the physical world, the parts of the operation that required presence rather than keystrokes. He did it without being asked to explain himself further, which was the only form of accountability he was capable of offering and which Luca accepted because the alternatives required time they didn't have. Reeves' lawyer called at 10:30 that night. Terms were discussed. Terms were settled. Reeve would present the corrected documentation at the summit and answer questions from the board as the CFO of a company that had successfully identified and terminated an internal financial compromise. He would not be prosecuted for his role. He would resign within 90 days with a settlement that made the whole thing disappear below the surface of the public record. He would provide a sealed deposition connecting Victor Strand directly to the operation that would live in Luca's possession indefinitely, as insurance, the kind that made future aggression too expensive to consider. Hale was quieter about it. Hale simply stopped coming to work. His keycard was deactivated. His office was cleared by 2 men in the night. The story that circulated in the building was that he had taken a personal leave of absence, which nobody questioned because the culture of Blackthorn Global was one in which people occasionally disappeared from their positions and were replaced, and the institution continued without registering the absence as something requiring explanation. On Thursday night, the night before the summit, Luca came to the 47th floor. Amara heard the key card. She was at the windows again, the position she returned to when the activity of the day compressed into something she needed to process from a distance. Chicago was cold below. October had moved in while she was inside this building, living through someone else's war, and the trees along the boulevard had gone amber and were dropping their leaves into the wind in slow, irregular spirals. Luca set a folder on the kitchen counter. "Tomorrow," he said. "I know. You don't have to be there." "I know that too." He stood beside her at the window, not close, the specific distance of 2 people who had shared something that hadn't been named yet and were being careful with the unnamed thing, not wanting to press on it before it had solidified enough to bear weight. "Reeve will perform," she said. "Chen says the documentation is clean." "And Strand?" "Strand is still at the Meridian." Luca paused. "He doesn't know we have Reeve. He came to watch a controlled demolition, and he's going to walk into a building where the explosives have already been removed." Amara looked at the city below. "What happens when he realizes?" "He leaves Chicago. He goes back to whatever architecture he builds next. He has enough insulation that legal action is a decade-long exercise with uncertain outcomes." Luca was quiet for a moment. "But we have his deposition, and his network inside Blackthorn is gone. And whatever he plans next, he builds it knowing that I have 3 years of documented evidence in a sealed file with a lawyer whose retainer is permanent." "Mutually assured," she said. "Yes. That's not justice." "No. He didn't try to make it something else. But it's stable. And stable is what keeps people alive." She turned to look at him. The city light came through the windows at an angle that found the lines in his face, the ones that weren't from age, the ones that came from specific kinds of pressure applied over specific kinds of time. He looked, in this light, like what he was. Not a legend. Not an urban myth whispered about in back rooms. A man who had made choices that accumulated into a life, the way all choices did, and was standing in the aftermath of the latest ones trying to determine the honest cost. "What happens to me?" she said. "After tomorrow." Luca met her eyes. "What do you want to happen?" She had given him a version of that question before, and she hadn't had an answer. She had one now. It had assembled itself over the past 5 days in the spaces between fear and function, between the device in her palm and Reeves' phone sliding across the desk, and the elevator rides between floors that kept rearranging what she thought she understood about the geography of power. "I don't want to clean floors anymore," she said. "All right. And I don't want to be invisible." "You haven't been invisible since the night you walked into my office." "That's not what I mean." She turned back to the window. "I mean, I want to matter. Not because someone hands it to me, because I built it." She paused. Marcus spent his whole life working inside systems that were designed to keep him exactly where he was. He worked hard and he was careful and he died anyway because the system didn't have a category for people like him except liability. I spent 14 months after his death doing the same thing he did, keeping my head down, being careful, being invisible. She felt the words coming from somewhere she hadn't accessed before. I don't want to do that anymore. Luca was quiet. She could feel him listening in the specific way he listened, not waiting for a pause to respond, actually taking in what was being said and measuring it against something internal. The company is compromised, he said finally. Reeve, Hale, 3 years of Strand's financial manipulation. The board is functional but structurally weakened. After tomorrow, it will need significant reorganization to be viable long-term. She looked at him. I'm not going to give you a company, he said. I want that to be clear. I'm not offering you something to manage. But there is an opportunity that is real and earned. The reorganization requires someone on the board who isn't affiliated with any faction inside this building. Someone the institutional investors will see as independent. Someone who has been inside this organization long enough to understand it without being contaminated by it. A janitor, she said. A person who has been in every room in this building for 10 months, while everyone who was supposed to be paying attention was running an 11-year financial conspiracy. She didn't respond immediately. The weight of it was something she needed to hold for a moment without moving, the way you held an object of uncertain structural integrity before committing to grip. I don't have a business degree, she said. Reeve had an MBA and spent 3 years embezzling on behalf of a man who was going to have him killed eventually. Credentials are a record of what someone was taught. They're not a record of what they're capable of. Amara looked at the city below and felt something shift that was not hope exactly. She had learned to be careful with hope, which had a history of extracting payment for its presence, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like the sensation of a door that had been locked for a long time being unlocked, not thrown open, just unlocked, with the specific understanding that what was on the other side was not guaranteed to be what she needed, but was at least accessible. She would decide what to do with accessible. That was something. The shareholder summit began at 9 in the morning. The 44th floor conference hall had been transformed for the event. 200 chairs arranged in angled rows facing a presentation screen, registration tables near the elevator bank, the light gray carpet vacuumed in the precise lines that Amara recognized as her own work from the previous week. She stood near the back wall in her gray maintenance uniform, which she had chosen deliberately, not because she needed to clean anything, but because she was not ready yet to stand anywhere else. Old habits had their uses. Invisibility had been her protection for so long that wearing it one final time felt like the correct way to say goodbye to it. Luca sat at the head of the board table on the raised platform at the front of the room. Reeve sat 2 chairs to his right. The board members filed in. The institutional investors. Executives from floors she had cleaned for 10 months. They took their seats with the organized rustling of people settling in for something they expected to be routine. Quarterly figures. Forward projections. The mechanical reassurances of a corporation demonstrating its own continuity. Victor Strand arrived at 9:12. She recognized him from the photograph on Chen's monitor. In person, he was less imposing than the photograph had suggested. The distinguished gravity of old money was there, but in the flesh it read differently, with the specific vulnerability of a man who had prepared extensively for an event that was not going to unfold as prepared for. He took a seat near the middle of the room among the institutional investors. His posture was controlled. His expression was the one she associated with patient people who had spent years cultivating the ability to wait without showing the waiting. Reeve began the presentation at 9:15. Amara watched his face throughout. The micro-expressions of a man doing something that cost him, not the content of the presentation, which was clean and accurate and told the story of a financially sound corporation that had successfully identified and removed an internal threat to its integrity, but the act of standing on the side of something he had spent 3 years working against. The face of a man paying his bill. He paid it. Every slide. Every figure. Every answer to every question from the floor. He was professional, precise. The CFO that Blackthorn needed him to be in this moment, for reasons that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with arithmetic. Strand asked a question from the floor at 9:54. It was a good question. technically sophisticated, designed to expose a crack in the financial narrative, framed as the neutral inquiry of a concerned institutional investor. In the version of this summit that Strand had planned, the question would have landed in a room that had already been primed by Reeves' corrupted data, and the crack would have opened, and the board would have seen instability, and the vote would have gone a specific way. Reeve answered it, cleanly, without hesitation, every number aligned, every record verifiable. The architecture Chen had built overnight held under the specific pressure it had been designed to withstand. Strand asked a follow-up question. Luca answered it from the head of the table, quietly, directly. Without the theatrical dominance that men in his position sometimes mistook for strength, just the even, controlled voice of a man who knew exactly where every piece was on the board and had decided to show that without making a performance of it. The room moved on. Strand did not ask a third question. At 10:40, the summit reached the agenda item that had not been on the published schedule. Luca stood at the podium. "I want to introduce a proposed board appointment," he said, "for consideration by the full membership and institutional representatives present." He looked toward the back of the room. 200 heads turned. Amara was standing against the back wall in her gray maintenance uniform, with her wrist splint visible and the fading bruise on her cheekbone still legible if you looked at her face, which 200 people were now doing. She did not look away. She had cleaned every room these people had ever used in this building. She had emptied their trash and wiped their tables and refilled their water glasses, and been background to 1,000 conversations that shaped the company she worked for without ever being allowed inside its actual functioning. She had done it for 10 months, and she had done it for Marcus, and she had done it because the world did not adjust itself to account for people like her, and the only way to survive inside it was to be useful until you found the specific moment when useful could become something else. This was that moment. Luca's voice moved through the room with the quiet certainty she had first heard it with, the register of a man who did not perform his authority because authority was so structurally embedded in his presence that performance would have been redundant. "Amara Vale," he said. "She has been in this building for 10 months. In that time, she has demonstrated a quality of attention that is in short supply at every level of this organization." He paused. "And she understands what this company looks like from every angle it has, including the ones none of us in this room have ever had to occupy." The room was very still. One board member near the front, she recognized him as the one who had called her a charity project, in the voice she had heard through a conference room wall, shifted in his chair with the tight movement of a man swallowing an objection. Strand, in the middle of the room, was watching. Amara met his eyes across 200 people. He held the contact for 3 seconds, long enough to communicate something that wasn't quite a concession. Men like Strand didn't concede, they recalculated, but was the acknowledgement of a specific outcome. The moment where the 4-year architecture collapsed into a single expression on the face of the man who had built it. Then he looked away. The vote was not unanimous. It was never going to be unanimous. 3 board members voted against, but the institutional investors, who had seen the financial presentation and heard Reeves' clean answers and understood from the collective silence of the room that something had already been decided at a level above their participation, voted with the majority. And the majority carried. Amara Vale joined the board of Blackthorn Global Holdings at 10:53 on a Thursday morning in October, wearing a gray maintenance uniform in a room full of people who had been walking past her for 10 months. Nobody missed it. Not this time. Strand left during the break between sessions. He left without speaking to anyone, moving through the lobby with the controlled efficiency of a man repurposing his energy for the next thing, the way water finds a new channel when one is blocked. He was out of the building by 11:15. He did not come back. In the weeks that followed, the machinery changed. Reeve resigned on schedule. His departure was handled with the clean quiet of an agreed-upon fiction, the press release mentioning personal considerations and the contribution of a valued team member. Hale's position was filled by someone brought in from outside who had no history in the building and no affiliations anyone could trace. Dante stayed. He stayed because Luca kept him. And Luca kept him because despite everything, the 8 weeks, the delayed documentation, the calculation that had cost Amara her ribs and her safety for a specific window of time, Dante was the best he had, and the best available was still the best available, and the world they operated in did not offer the luxury of replacing functional pieces because they had revealed their flaws under pressure. Everything had flaws. The question was whether the flaws were the same as the failures, and in Dante's case the two were not identical. Dante was careful with her after that. Not warm. Careful. The specific caution of a person who had been forced to revise a judgment they had made confidently and was still in the process of integrating what the revision meant about their own assessment faculties. She respected the honesty of it more than she would have respected false warmth. Over the following months, Amara learned the company from the inside, not from the angle of the cart and the cleaning cloth, but from the angle of the board table, which was a different kind of invisibility problem. The executives who hadn't noticed her when she cleaned their rooms now noticed her constantly and couldn't fully manage their discomfort with what she represented. She handled that the way she had handled everything in the past year, without flinching, without performance, by doing the work until the work became its own argument. She raised wages for the maintenance staff on her third week on the board, not as a gesture, as a line item in an operational proposal that outlined the correlation between turnover rates, training costs, and institutional knowledge retention, and concluded that the company was spending more managing the instability created by low wages than it would cost to raise them. The board voted yes because the numbers supported it, and the numbers supporting it was something she had made certain of before walking into the room. She established a healthcare allocation for all building staff on her 6th week. She created a hardship fund for employees managing catastrophic medical debt on her 8th, because she understood the specific architecture of that kind of weight in a way that could not be learned from a financial report or an MBA program or 11 years in a CFO's chair. She did not do these things because she was grateful to Luca. She did them because Marcus was dead and the system that killed him was still running, and she was now inside a piece of that system with enough leverage to change some of its edges, and she intended to use that leverage until it was gone, or she was. The night she signed the final paperwork establishing the hardship fund, she sat for a long time in the empty conference room on the 44th floor, the room where Luca had crouched beside her, the room where she had told the truth about the alley, about the men and the boots and the cracked ribs, and he had looked at the board members with the specific expression of a man cataloging who had failed to see something right in front of them. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was the same city it had always been, cold now, the lake invisible in the dark, present only as an absence in the grid of lights. She heard him before she saw him. The particular rhythm of footsteps she had learned to identify in hallways and elevators and the service corridors of the upper floors, deliberate, unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who had stopped performing his own certainty somewhere in the past 2 months and was still adjusting to what that felt like. Luca stopped in the doorway. He looked at her across the length of the conference table, the same table she had polished at midnight, the same table where the board had watched him hand her a pen. "You're still here," he said. "I work here." "It's 11:30. "So do you." He came into the room, sat at the table, not at the head but at the side, a few chairs down from where she was. The casual positioning of someone who had stopped needing the architecture of dominance to feel stable. "The hardship fund," he said. "It passed." "I know. I voted yes." "I know you did." He looked at the table surface for a moment, the reflection of the ceiling lights in the polished wood, the same grain she had learned with a cloth and a spray bottle in the middle of the night for 10 months. "Your brother," he said. Amara was quiet. What was he like? The question landed differently than she expected. Not the formal inquiry of a man making conversation. Something more open than that. The question of someone who had heard a name spoken with a specific weight and wanted to understand what the weight was made of. She thought about Marcus, the alive version. The burned eggs and the loud laugh and the cracked screen phone and the $11 in the wallet. The way he called her Mara. The way he tipped his head back when something surprised him. Like the world kept exceeding his expectations despite all available evidence. Like he had made a decision somewhere early in his life to keep expecting things and had held to that decision even when the evidence mounted against it. "Loud," she said. "He was really loud. He laughed at things that weren't that funny, and he burned every meal he ever tried to cook, and he had this phone with a cracked screen that he kept saying he was going to replace and never did." She looked at the window. He thought the world was better than it was. Not stupid better, not naive. He held on to the idea that it could be, even when it kept showing him otherwise. Luca was quiet. He would have thought all of this was the most insane thing he ever heard, she said. Me. On a board. In this building. Any of it. She felt the specific warmth behind her eyes that she had learned to hold without letting it break through in rooms like this. He would have called me at midnight every night with 100 questions. Would you have answered? Every single one. The room settled around that. Luca looked at his hands on the table, a rare, unguarded position, the hands visible, not folded or controlled, just resting. She had learned to read his stillness over the past weeks in the way she had learned to read all the rooms she had spent time inside, by the quality of what it contained rather than what it showed. I have not been careful with you, he said. No. I moved quickly. I used the leverage I had. I put you in a position that served my needs and told myself it served yours too, and those two things were not equally true. She looked at him. I'm not apologizing, he said. I'm telling you what I know to be accurate. I know you're not apologizing. You don't do that. I am capable, you do accountability, she said. It's not the same thing. Apology is about the person apologizing. What you do is about the situation. It's different. He held her gaze with an expression she had no precedent for in his face. Something undefended, something that had set down the permanent low-level threat assessment long enough to simply look at her. You see very clearly, he said. I've had a lot of practice being somewhere nobody looks. Outside the windows, Chicago moved through its midnight rhythms. The city that had watched all of this from 44 floors below without knowing the shape of it. The city where a woman had been beaten in an alley and gone back to work the next day and walked through a door she couldn't open from the inside and come out on the other side of something that had no clean name. Amara looked at the polished table, her reflection in it, indistinct, present. She had cleaned this surface 400 times. She would not clean it again. What she would do instead was still forming, the specifics of a future that was no longer a calculation of minimum viable survival, but something she was building from a position she had not occupied before, with tools she was still learning to hold, in a building that had tried to use her up and found that she was not that kind of material. Go home, she said to Luca. You live 3 floors up, I know. She stood, picked up the folder with the hardship fund documentation, the signed copies she would file in the morning. Go anyway. I'll be here when you come back. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood. He moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped, the way she had stopped in Reeves' doorway, pulled by something that didn't have a cleaner description than the simple pull of 2 people who had been through something together and were still in the process of understanding what the something had made them. Mara, he said. The name landed like a stone into still water. She hadn't told him Marcus called her that. She didn't know how he knew, and maybe he didn't. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe he had found it somewhere in the documents or the conversations that had surrounded her life for the past months and had held it until the moment it was the right thing to say. She did not turn around, but she felt it. The warmth behind her eyes, this time not held back, this time allowed. Private, in the empty room above a sleeping city, in the space between what she had been and what she was building, in the place where Marcus's name for her still lived after 14 months in the specific acoustic chamber of grief that never fully went quiet. Good night, she said. His footsteps moved down the corridor. She stood in the empty conference room above Chicago, alone with the city light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the polished table reflecting it, and the signed documentation in her hands that would, in the morning, put a small piece of the machine to a different use than it had been built for. She thought about Marcus. She thought about him the full way. Not just the alive part, but the whole shape of it, the dying, and the debt, and the $11, and the burned eggs, and the loud laugh, and the cracked screen phone he never replaced, because he kept believing he would get to it eventually, kept believing eventually was a thing he had. She let herself feel the full weight of that. Then she picked up her folder. She turned off the conference room light. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and rode down through the floors of a building that had once swallowed her whole, and had, in the end, been unable to keep her invisible. The doors opened on the lobby. The overnight receptionist looked up from her paperback. "Good night, Ms. Vale," she said. Amara stopped. Nobody in this lobby had ever spoken her name before. Not in 10 months of 4 in the morning exits and service entrance arrivals, and the practiced invisibility of a woman the building had registered as furniture. She looked at the receptionist, a woman maybe 10 years younger than her, with tired eyes and a worn paperback and a coffee thermos that was probably cold by now. "Good night," Amara said. She went through the front door, not the service entrance, the front door, the one that opened onto the main street with its nighttime traffic and its October wind, and its city that didn't care what any of them were doing up there in the lit towers, and walked out into Chicago. The wind took her breath for a second. She let it. Then she pulled her jacket closed and walked, and the city moved around her the way cities do, indifferent and enormous, and full of the specific noise of a million lives running their particular calculations. And somewhere inside all of that noise was the debt that no longer existed, and the brother who could not be brought back, and the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming, and the distance between those two things that was not large enough yet to stop feeling, but was large enough, just barely, to walk through. She walked through it. She kept walking.